is Dawn Hammett, and I'm the director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum here in beautiful Abilene, Kansas. It's a beautiful day here, and we have with us Alyce Evans. Alyce works at for the National Park Service at the Gettysburg Historic Site for the Eisenhower home, and she's going to talk to us today about Ike and Mamie's life at the farm. So, Alyce, do you want to just go ahead and take it away?
Sure. Well, good. I guess now afternoon, everyone. It's afternoon. I have worked for the Eisenhower National Historic Site in a couple different capacities. I started off as an intern, fresh-faced out of college, and then I was fortunate enough for 12 years to be a seasonal at the Eisenhower Farm before I briefly went over to the Gettysburg battlefield in a permanent capacity as a volunteer coordinator for their maintenance division. But I was lucky enough in the winter, early winter, January of 2018, to come back as a park guide at Eisenhower. I've spent a lot of my life researching about the Eisenhowers and their time here in Gettysburg. I even wrote my master's thesis about then Captain Eisenhower's experiences at Camp Colt in 1918 and how he dealt with the 1918 pandemic, the Spanish flu, when it came to Gettysburg. So I've spent a lot of time learning and getting familiar with the Eisenhowers and their story at Gettysburg. So I'm really excited to spend some time today with all of you talking about the Eisenhowers and Gettysburg. So let's get the PowerPoint up and we'll get into it. So if we can go to the next slide, that would be great. We have a lovely photo there, though, of the Eisenhower's home. If you haven't been to Gettysburg, that's the front door of the Eisenhower's home that you can see in that black and white photo. I have some more photos later in this PowerPoint that will illuminate the house a little more. But to start our story of Gettysburg today, we're going to go back a little bit before the Eisenhowers actually find themselves residents of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Some of you might be familiar with General Eisenhower's wartime correspondence with Mamie. I find these letters to be fascinating in so many different capacities. First off, the fact that General Eisenhower handwrote almost every letter to Mamie because he knew she would be upset if he dictated a letter to her. That's why he always took the time to write if he could. But in December of 1943, he writes, I think, a very illuminating letter to Mamie. Here he is, he's in the center of the war. D-Day is yet to come. They're still kind of, he's in Africa. There's just so much uncertainty. They have no idea when this war is going to end, when he'll be able to come home. But in that period, he is thinking about the future. And he wrote to Mamie on December 2nd, 1943, "When this hectic war is over, I often wonder whether anyone who has carried heavy responsibilities, has had to jump constantly hither to thither to yon, can really settle down and live a serene life. The eternal pound, pound, pound seems a burden, but when it once ceases, it is possible that many of us will be nigh onto nervous wrecks, wholly unfit for normal life. But then, being lazy by nature, I think there is hope for me. I know that when I find myself contemplating a post-war existence, I always picture a little place far away from cities, but with someone near enough for occasional bridge, and the two of us just getting brown in the sun, and possibly thick in the middle, a place, a dozen cats and dogs with a horse or two, maybe a place to fish, not too strenuously, and a field in which to shoot a few birds once in a while. I think that's roughly my idea of a good life." And that letter really stands out to me as an employee of the Eisenhower National Historic Site, because there he is, years away from purchasing the Gettysburg Farm, and he's kind of describing exactly what they will eventually have. Now, a common question we get from our visitors who come to the farm, they're like, why Gettysburg? If people are familiar with General Eisenhower and his story, they usually ask, well, why didn't he settle in Kansas? Isn't Kansas home? And I say, well, yeah, I think in his heart, Abilene was always home. But there were a lot of things that drew the Eisenhowers to Gettysburg and made it a natural choice for a retirement home. They had previous connections to the town of Gettysburg. And there are two photographs that are kind of on the side of this slide. One of them shows what looks like a lot of West Point cadets sitting on stairs or standing at the top of stairs together. That, of course, is the famous class of West Point of 1915, the class the stars fell upon, right? Because more generals will come from this graduating class than any other in West Point history. Of course, 5-star General Eisenhower is sitting there. He's actually in downtown Gettysburg. If you're familiar with downtown, there's a famous church right off the square called the Christ Lutheran Church. It was used as an emergency field hospital during the Battle of Gettysburg. And all of the cadets that came on this field trip to Gettysburg in 1915 took a photograph there to commemorate this field ride that they took around the battlefield. Of course, General Eisenhower as a youth was quite the student of history, but it really wasn't until he went to West Point that he developed a real interest in the Civil War. And I think this trip to Gettysburg, where he actually got feet on the ground and saw the landscape firsthand and really delved into the tactics of the Battle of Gettysburg, that definitely made him a lifelong advocate of the battlefield and definitely someone who studied the Battle of Gettysburg extensively. So that first trip in 1915, even though it's very brief, is going to have a major impact on Eisenhower. But the second time he comes to Gettysburg, it's for a slightly longer period. And I think this Camp Colton 1918 is a really pivotal moment in the life of Dwight David Eisenhower. The Eisenhowers lived in Gettysburg roughly from March until November of 1918. Of course, that date should mean something to all of us. That's the second year we're involved in the First World War. And for then Captain Eisenhower, he's a captain when he arrives in Gettysburg in March of 1918. This is a very disappointing command. He had thought he was finally going to get overseas to France with a group of tankers. Instead, he discovers that he's being sent to Gettysburg to command a camp to train soldiers to pilot tanks. So he's very disappointed, but quickly there are pluses to this assignment that I don't think he really thought about when he was initially sent to Gettysburg. First off, he's able to secure housing almost immediately for Mamie and their first son, whose given name was Dowd, though of course the family nickname was Icky. In that small triangle, you can see the happy family standing outside their Springs Avenue home in Gettysburg. Not uncommon for the early lives of this family. The Eisenhowers, they're only here for a few months, but they will move 3 times. They will live in 3 different houses in Gettysburg over the course of those few months they're here. It's really important that they were able to live together as a family. Of course, tragically, I think the majority of us realize that that beautiful little boy in that photograph is only going to make it to the age of 3. He's going to die young from scarlet fever. So these months that the Eisenhowers spend in Gettysburg, I really think it's one of the longest periods where all 3 of them are together and they get to truly be a family, because tragically they were separated for large chunks of time during that little boy's life. So I think when the Eisenhowers looked back at Gettysburg in 1918, there was a fondness. There were so many happy memories. They got to celebrate Icky's first birthday together in Gettysburg. So I think that was definitely a positive when they looked back at that time. And for, Captain Eisenhower eventually gets promoted to Major Eisenhower. This is certainly the first time he is the commanding officer. It's a very trying time. Like I mentioned earlier, the Spanish flu arrives in the camp in the fall of 1918. So he really had a lot of training in leadership skills. I think that will start him down the path to eventually becoming General Eisenhower. So Camp Colts, I think, it's only a few months of his life, but it's a very pivotal moment. So these connections to Gettysburg, when they thought back to these moments, they said, yeah, Gettysburg's a beautiful town. We love the community. We love the surrounding area. It wouldn't be a bad place to retire to. And of course, as that letter that he wrote to Mamie in 1943 suggests, he's thinking farming. You know, when he tries to imagine himself in retirement, having a farm somewhere out in the countryside is very appealing to him. You know, after the war, I think the general became very interested in the idea of soil conservation. I think a lot of soldiers who have seen as much destruction as our soldiers saw during the Second World War, they come back with a desire to improve land, to leave, as Ike said, the land better than he found it. So he was definitely interested in finding a farm that maybe needed a little bit of help, something that would keep him occupied in retirement, and he's definitely going to find that in Gettysburg. But another reason Gettysburg was appealing was they had friends in the area. I mean, isn't that nice? Before you go to an area, to at least know that there's somebody you can call if you have an emergency or you just want to have a nice, you know, sit down dinner. Or of course, as the Eisenhowers were very concerned about having bridge friends around, make sure they could have a good game of bridge when the time came. So actually, George Allen and his wife Mary lived off the Emmitsburg Road in Gettysburg. That's a road that runs right through the battlefield and right down into Maryland, over the Mason-Dixon line. So George and Mary Allen in the 1940s were already established in Gettysburg. George Allen was part of Ike's, what they called Ike's Millionaires. He saw George Allen as mostly just another friend at the bridge table. George Allen's kind of an interesting person in the history of Washington, D.C. and President Eisenhower. His autobiography is called very cleverly, I think, Presidents Who Have Known Me. So it sort of gives you, I think, a description of George Allen right there. He did work for both FDR and Truman in their administrations, and he was pretty instrumental in helping to inspire General Eisenhower to run as a candidate in 1952. But they were very good friends. They already owned a farm in Gettysburg, so it's certainly appealing to have those friends right down the road when you're looking for a spot to settle. But as much as through the 1940s, General Eisenhower was pretty adamant that he didn't think he was going to run for the presidency. I do think by the late 40s, it's on his radar. It's starting to become more of a possibility. So the idea of owning a Gettysburg farm would make it very appealing as a presidential retreat someday, should he ever end up in Washington. And even if he didn't become president, he's still a five-star general. He's still being consulted by presidents in the Pentagon. Being close to Washington probably played a major part in why he chose Gettysburg potentially over any other location he might have wanted to settle at. Right, we go to the next slide. So I just very briefly want to talk a little bit about the farm before the Eisenhowers moved in, because it does have quite a history that predates the time. We've got some lovely photographs here that show the farm. One's in 1890, the other shows it shortly around the time the Eisenhowers purchased it in the 1950s. But the origins of the property that the Eisenhowers eventually purchased goes all the way to the colonial period in American history. Of course, William Penn was the founder of Pennsylvania, and he had large areas of land surveyed. His sons actually had, in what is now the area of Adams County, an area called the Manor of Mask. They did a survey in the 1740s of this area that they called this manor. It was named after a relatives of theirs home back in England. And in that 1740s survey, a man named Quentin Armstrong is listed as the owner of the property that General Eisenhower will eventually purchase in the 1950s. Quentin Armstrong is going to be the person that first starts building on the property that the Eisenhowers will eventually purchase. He will build, I think what sounds delightful, a two-story log cabin on the spot where the Eisenhowers' home stands today. Keep that log cabin in the back of your mind. We'll be returning to that story a little bit later when we talk about the renovations. Quentin Armstrong had 2 children, Quentin Jr. and Isaac. So he actually splits his property upon his death so that both sons have land to farm and to have their families. So Quentin Jr. will get what becomes the Eisenhower farm, and his son Isaac gets actually where I am today right now, the farm right adjacent to General Eisenhower's home. I'm actually sitting in Isaac Armstrong's 1790s farmhouse. It looks nothing like what Isaac would have known. It's our library I'm in right now. But the 2 farms will basically remain separated for the remainder of their history until they come together again in the early 1900s, and then they'll be connected by General Eisenhower and his cattle partners. After the Armstrongs own the farm, it's going to change hands a couple times. But another question we really get from our visitors, of course, being in Gettysburg, our visitors are very curious about what was happening in the farm during the Battle of Gettysburg. During the 1860s, the farm was owned by a man named John Besecker. If you're familiar with the battle at all, there are areas of conflict called Besecker's Woods. That was all part of property owned by John Besecker. Though he is not living in the Eisenhower farmhouse, what will become the Eisenhower farmhouse during the battle, he's actually renting it to a man named Adam Bollinger. And so it's Adam Bollinger and his family who are kind of looking in dread at the impending Confederate forces. The Eisenhower farm, the Bollinger farm at the time, was behind Confederate lines, essentially. A Longstreet's division will come right through the farm. They will establish reserve areas behind the Confederate line. They will have emergency field hospitals, things like that. The farm basically saw a lot of destruction. Their crops were trampled, livestock stolen. Several Confederate soldiers were buried directly on the ground. Remember, it's July, it's hot. They're getting those soldiers who have passed away from their injuries buried pretty quickly. So the Bollingers kind of come back to a little bit of chaos in their home. Again, I don't want to go through every person who owned this farm. Their hands changed several times. But in the left-hand side of the photograph, you see a kind of a sepia-colored photo that says Eisenhower Farm 1890. So you can see the main farmhouse, and to the right of the photograph in the back, there's a very large barn. That barn was built by the Plank family in 1887. Tragically, the original barn that stood on the ground, the one that was used as an emergency field hospital by those Confederate soldiers, the Planks tore that structure down, and they'll build that barn you see in the background. That barn still stands today at the Eisenhower National Historic Site. If you've been to the Eisenhower farm, it's the green 2-story bank barn that's just a few yards away from the Eisenhower's home. So that barn dates back to 1887. So that photo you see on the left that says Eisenhower Farm 1890 with that beautiful farmhouse and the barn next to it. And that's probably the Plank family and standing in front. Can't say that for certain, but they would have been the owners at the time that photograph was taken. But the next family I want to talk about in this storyline, they were purchased the farm in the early 1920s, and that's going to be Alan and Caroline Redding. The Reddings will be the ones who eventually sell the farm to the Eisenhowers. In the late 1940s, the Eisenhowers and the Reddings are kind of on the same page. Ike and Mamie are thinking about settling down somewhere permanently, having a home of their own. The Reddings are thinking their farm is too big. They want to downsize. None of their children are interested in continuing with farming. So because of these two ideas are going to come together pretty fluently. Now, I mentioned, of course, George and Mary Allen. But when the Eisenhowers start kind of putting out feelers of where they'd like to settle down, and Gettysburg kind of comes up on their radar, the Allens mentioned to the Eisenhowers that they have a farm right down the road from them that they hear is about to go up on the market. So many years later, Mamie talked about that, the Allens mentioning this farm and her coming to visit for the first time. So I'd like to read a quote from Mamie. "Well, Ike and myself had been looking for some place to go in the summertime. And we looked up and down the Hudson. Well, they were mansions, and I knew I couldn't staff them. So I said, aren't there any other places around here? And this man who had sold them referring to the Allens, they said, the house, well, there's one house or farm over here owned by a Mr. Redding, and he says he's going to sell. Well, Ike," he said, "Mamie, you go over and look at it." Mrs. Allen brought me over, and she sort of slurred my name so they didn't know it was Eisenhower. And I looked at this place, and I saw these 3 big trees and their ashes, and they had a big square kitchen, and that appealed to me to no end, you see. And I said, oh, I've just got to have that place. And Ike said, well, Mamie, if you like it, buy it. The old gentleman then decided not to sell. Well, of course, woman-like, if I couldn't have what I wanted, well, I was heartbroken. In about 3 months, though, he decided to sell again. We had to buy everything, all the equipment, worn out and otherwise, and he went way up on his price, but we eventually took it with the understanding, of course, that we were coming back there for the following summer. We felt it was a place we could walk in, close the door, and walk off. So that was Mamie's first encounter with the farm. And eventually the general did also come to visit before they finally settled on the price. And as Mamie suggested in this, the Reddings had a little bit of cold feet about halfway through the process, and they thought maybe that they would keep up the farm. And it took a little bit more negotiation going back and forth between the Eisenhowers realtors, and eventually they settled on an agreement that was amenable to both parties. The Eisenhowers officially purchased the Redding farmhouse on January 15th, 1951. In the purchase, it included 189 acres of farmland, the old house, barn, outbuildings, equipment, all farm animals, which included approximately 25 Holstein milk cows, a dozen heifers, a few white Chester hogs, some white leghorn chickens, and 1 horse. So for all that, for all the farm equipment, the land, the buildings, the animals, the Eisenhowers spent $40,000 purchasing this farm, which today sounds pretty great. But let's say in Adams County in 1951, that wasn't the best sale price that this county had ever seen. But the Eisenhowers were delighted. And in that lower picture you see on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint, that's what they purchased. You can see the old Redding farmhouse. There's a few out structures that are going to vanish over the period of Reconstruction. And of course, that old 1887 Plank family barn is still standing. Now, unfortunately for the Eisenhowers, they purchased the farm in January of 1951, and almost immediately, General Eisenhower finds himself called back into active duty by President Truman. He's going to head over to NATO to work there. So General Eisenhower came up with the idea of approaching his good friend, General Arthur Nevins. General Eisenhower and General Nevins had known each other since World War I. They kind of kept running across each other in the military between the world wars. And then, of course, during the Second World War, General Nevins was on Eisenhower's staff, at Supreme Allied Headquarters. So he calls up General Nevins. He knows that General Nevins was kind of, uncertain of the next step in life, if he was going to retire, what he was going to do. And he suggested that Nevins become his farm manager. He knew General Nevins had grown up on a farm, and Nevins was a little taken aback by this. He knew farming had changed an awful lot since the 19-teens, but after a little negotiation, General Nevins agreed to become General Eisenhower's farm manager. That photograph on the top actually shows General Nevins with his wife Anne sitting there with General Eisenhower. That was taken in the old living room of the farmhouse before renovations by the Eisenhowers occurred. her. So while Ike and Mamie are packing their bags for Paris, France, the Nevins will move into the Reading farmhouse, and they will begin the initial upkeep of the farm. The first thing that General Nevins kind of had to do was find some staff to help him. So he actually briefly hired Raphael Reading. He was one of the Reading sons, and a man named Evan Feaster. Eventually, Raphael will leave. He wants to start a singing career in New York, but Evan Feaster will become a major player in the Eisenhower farms. And we have all these great letters between Nevins and General Eisenhower while he's over in Paris establishing the farm, how it will operate. We'll talk a little bit more about how the farm transforms in a later slide. I'd actually like to talk a little bit now about our next slide and talk about kind of how this farm becomes how they rebuild this farm, first. So I have some great photos of the building during renovations. So renovations began in the spring of 1953. So that's after the Eisenhowers have returned from the United States. They've had the whirlwind campaign in 52, and now they are living in Washington, D.C. So they have a primary residence. They have the time to rip up their Gettysburg farmhouse. They don't have to be living in it. So they initially contacted a man named George S. Brock Jr. He was an architect, and they asked Mr. Brock to come to the house and sort of evaluate the condition of it. What was sound, what wasn't, what needed to be done to do the renovations they were interested in. Now, I remember I told you to keep that old Quentin Armstrong log cabin in the back of your mind. Well, this is when the Eisenhowers and everyone is going to discover that the core of the farmhouse they have just purchased is that old 1700s log cabin. It had simply had a layer of brick placed over it. Brock comes back to them and he basically says, I'm sorry, President Eisenhower, the best thing you could do is just knock that whole structure over and start over from scratch. The Eisenhowers are heartbroken, especially Mamie. They both really enjoyed the age of the structure and they wanted to save what they could. So in the left-hand corner of the PowerPoint, you can see a photograph before renovations began. And then you'll see there are two photographs that show a small section of brick house. It looks basically like one window up and one window down, right? It's a very small section. That was an addition that was built on to the original Quentin Armstrong log cabin, somewhere probably like in the 1840s, maybe the 1830s. And that's probably when the house was completely bricked over. So since that small structure didn't have log as its main foundation, it was sound enough to come into the new home's design. So today, if you were to visit the site, it's really only the kitchen on the first floor and the maid's room on the second that have any date that exists prior to the Eisenhower's time here. The majority of the farmhouse as it stands today only dates back to the 1950s. So the next slide has a lovely comparison of the two farm views. So you can see the farm before the Eisenhowers did their renovations, and then you can see a current photo of the farm as it looks today. The house, that's kind of hard to see in the modern photo through some of the trees, but the house almost doubles in size. The Eisenhowers are going to build around the core of what had been the Reading family farmhouse and expand to two different sections. They keep the old plank family barn, though it ceases to be red. They paint it this interesting color of green, which was chosen by President Eisenhower. That's what he wanted all of the outbuildings to be. If you look in the modern photograph, right in front of the old bank barn, there's kind of a low rectangular building. The Eisenhowers will build that structure in the 1960s. It was basically a garage and storage unit. If you visit the site today, it's our reception center where we have our museums and exhibits. There's some lovely pictures in the next slide that show the house during construction. I like the two photos that are in the top and the middle on the left and the middle on the top slide. That's actually Mamie's mother with President Eisenhower, that's Mrs. Elvira Dowd, and he's showing her all of the renovations to the home. So you can see there's a couple different photographs of construction. I love this photograph of Ike and Mamie showing off their fireplace in the living room. If you've never been to our site, we have a beautiful fireplace that was once in the East Room of the White House. It was removed during the Grant administration and given to the Eisenhowers by the White House staff for their wedding anniversary. So that is the photo, that is the mantle that Ike and Mamie are standing in front of. Mamie's actually pointing to the inscription that says it was a gift from the White House staff. And then there's a lovely photograph of Mamie in the bottom showing to some of the congressmen's wives the beautiful picture window that is one of the focal points of their living room today. So these are some nice photos. So the house, it takes about 2 years for them to finish all the renovations. They begin spring 1953 and they'll finish in the spring of 1955. And that's when really the house starts to become a presidential retreat for them in every sense of the word. We sneak on over to the next slide. There are really 3 ways I see the Eisenhowers using this farmhouse: as a political center, as a farm, and as a family home. I'd like to start talking first about how President Eisenhower used this farm successfully as a political center. Even before he's president, he'll hold rallies at the farmhouse. That top photograph you see, that's candidate Eisenhower in 1952 at a rally he held in June of 52 at the farm. They invited Republican delegates from Pennsylvania to come and have a picnic behind the house, and the president spoke from the back porch of the house to all of the delegates that came there, expressing his campaign points and where his campaign was going to go from that point. So he'll do that repeatedly throughout his presidency. Actually, in the summer of 1955, after renovations are finished, they'll invite the entire White House staff to a picnic to celebrate their 38th wedding anniversary on July 1st. In 1956, in September of 56, he'll have a big rally for his reelection. Over 1,000 people are hosted in tents in the backyard. So he literally welcomed these people to his private home, hoping that they could see who he was as an individual, as well as his strength as a political candidate. But the house was also a place for him to relax and recuperate as president. Obviously, being president of the United States is a pretty stressful job. So he often came to his Gettysburg Farm simply to get away from it all, to find himself again and relax and de-stress. One of the most important moments of him recuperating will, of course, be after his 1955 heart attack. Now, President Eisenhower had that heart attack in September of 1955. He'll spend 7 weeks in the hospital there out in Denver where he had the heart attack before returning very briefly to Washington, D.C., but then really finishing his recuperation in Gettysburg. The Eisenhowers felt it would be more conducive for his health if he came to the farm. He could still be close to Washington. He could still meet with his cabinet. He could start taking on more of the responsibilities of the presidency again, but that the Gettysburg Farm would be a quieter, more relaxing place for him to get him back into speed. So he'll be there till basically a week before Christmas, 1955, and that's when he'll go back to Washington full time. One of the things I love about this time period when he was recovering from his heart attack, he actually started to walk up and down the front lane. If you walk from the Eisenhower's home to the main gate of their farm lane, it's about a mile full trip. So it was an easy way to mark how far he had gone each day. And there's all these beautiful Norwegian spruces up and down the front lane. And they were gifts from the Republican Party of each state. So Mamie would know how far her husband went each day because he'd come back and say, "Well, Mamie, I made it to Texas today." So then she would know which tree he had walked to and turned around. But I think the most clever way he used the farm as a political tool was as a diplomatic site. He liked to bring important people to the farm, especially world leaders, because I think the president was such a savvy reader of human nature. You see that throughout his leadership, both as a general and as president. He knew how to put people at ease and how to get them to open up to him. So by bringing these world leaders to his farm, he hoped that by inviting them into his private home, they would relax. They would get away from the cameras. They would get away from the White House, which is innately a political entity, which has all that history and etiquette sort of hanging over one's head, just down to his private farm. And as he put it, they could talk man to man, just get to the root of the problem. So we have hosted many world leaders here at the Eisenhower Farm. The first world leader and the only one to spend the night was Prime Minister Nehru of India, and he came to visit in December of 1956. His visit was pretty casual, though. There's actually a photograph here. That's who Eisenhower is standing with that beautiful Black Angus cow. That's Prime Minister Nehru. It always amazes me that he brings the leader of India to a cattle farm, but Nehru seemed to not mind the visit. And they had very personal discussions on the Eisenhower's porch, the president's favorite room there. Like I said, Nehru was the only world leader, though, that actually slept in the Eisenhower home. We're going to have a lot of different visitors that come for the day, basically. And those visitors included men like Churchill, de Gaulle, Khrushchev, and all of their visits went a particular way. Usually they would helicopter in, and then what President Eisenhower would do is he would take them directly to his cattle barns. He didn't invite them into the house right away. He was very excited to show off his cattle operation. So they would go up, they would view the cattle, and then they would come back to the Eisenhower's home, and then they would sit on the back porch together, and that's where they would have their discussions. Probably the most famous visit is that of Khrushchev to the farm. Of course, this is 1959 when Khrushchev comes. He comes in September of 59. This is a very important moment in the Cold War. And I think for a brief moment, there's a little thaw in the Cold War at our Gettysburg Farm as these two men find common ground at this farm in Gettysburg. All right, why don't we go ahead to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit now about the farm itself. The Redding family had operated a dairy farm, basically is what Eisenhower purchased, but he was much more interested in a Black Angus operation and having a beef cattle instead. In the 40s, he had met several friends down in Texas who already owned show herds of Black Angus cattle. So that's where he decides to start switching. So General Nevins, as his farm manager, will be instrumental in switching from the dairy operation to the Black Angus operation. George Allen comes back into the story at this point. The president did not have enough capital to start a show herd himself. So he had several partners that assisted him, George Allen being one of the first, and then several other sort of wealthy Texas oilmen who come into this operation. Eisenhower was really pleased with what Nevins was doing with the cattle, but he really wanted someone who had a little bit more interest and more focus in the idea of raising a show herd. So in that center photograph, you see the man sort of holding the reins of that Angus. He's pointing to his leg there. That's Bob Hartley. Bob Hartley is a really important gentleman in the story of the Eisenhower farms. That's actually in the background. You can see President Eisenhower, Mamie, and it's actually the King and Queen of Afghanistan with this cow in the background in the early 1960s. But Bob Hartley had gone to Penn State at the time that Milton Eisenhower, Ike's youngest brother, was president of Penn State, and his focus was agriculture, was sort of cattle husbandry. Bob Hartley hoped to operate a show herd for someone. So with the Penn State connection through Milton Eisenhower, Ike was eventually put in contact with Bob Hartley, and he agreed to come and start really beefing up the cattle operation here. They were able to eventually secure a really good bull. If you're going to have a good show herd, you need good stock. So Ike's favorite cow was a bull named Anconian 3551. He was the star of the Eisenhower Farm. And Bob Hartley worked very hard. They did a lot of breeding with Anconian, and they were able to get a lot of prize winners out of that bull. Every day, the cattle were, once a week, the cattle were washed, whether they needed it or not. They were then, their hair was blown dried and all curled. They would curl the hair of all these cows to get them used to it before showing. The Eisenhowers eventually, with their cattle partners, purchased and built a show barn at the top of the neighboring farm. And that's where all the prize winners were kept. Bob Hartley had a lot of great oral histories with the site, and he said Ike was not a difficult person to work with. He was kind of a weekend farmer. But the last point I'd like to make is that this was the Eisenhower's home. More than anything else, that was the important thing. This was finally that home where they could walk away and just close the door and have the two of them. So I have a couple photographs of Ike and Mamie here on the farm. The photograph of Mamie by herself, she's actually sitting on that famous porch. And there are so many stories about that porch beyond just the political ones, of course. Their grandparents, they were grandparents, of course, one of those important roles they had in their lives. And their grandchildren tell so many great stories of spending time with their grandparents on that porch. David Eisenhower, in his book about the retirement years here on the farm, tells this great story about the Eisenhowers kind of fighting over what channel to watch. There were only 3 channels to flip through, and yet they had this massive debate over which channel to watch. The porch was really, I think, the place where Ike and Mamie could be themselves. The general liked to paint out there. When he was painting, Mamie usually sat in the background quiet. Even if they weren't interacting, Mamie wanted to be in the same room as the general. Of course, they were separated so often in their married life that, especially in retirement, they wanted to spend as much time together. So she would sit in the background and do crossword puzzles or read a book just to be in the same space as them. So I think it's there that they really finally got that home that they were always wanting. Though in 1967, the Eisenhowers finally make the decision of what to do with their beloved farm. There were a lot of choices. You know, they had offered the farm first to their son, John, and he didn't think he'd be able to keep the farm aspect going, and the general really wanted the farmland to stay intact. So in 1967, Ike and Mamie decide to donate the home and grounds to the Department of the Interior. And actually on the next slide, I have a really lovely quote. In 1967, shortly before Thanksgiving, the Eisenhowers met with a representative of the Department of the Interior to sign over their home. And this was a really, they were both on board. Ike and Mamie had made this decision. This is what they wanted to happen. But for Mamie, it was, I think, more difficult than Ike. She actually quipped at one point, oh, back in government housing, because they were going to cease to own the house. They were allowed to remain in it until their deaths, but it would now be government property. But there's this lovely, Horace Busby actually wrote a letter to then President Johnson about this moment. And he wanted to sort of convey the gravity of this moment and what it meant for the Eisenhowers. And he wrote this quote to President Johnson. Mrs. Eisenhower associates the porch on which we were seated with the general's recovery from his illness while president. After his heart attack, she had called the architect from Denver and arranged to have the porch enclosed so there would be a sunny and cheerful place for recuperation on the first floor. Later, after his second illness, the general had again spent most of his recuperation at the Gettysburg Farm. My son tells me, she said, the farm and the porch have lengthened Ike's life twice already. And she added very softly, I don't suppose you could ask for more. I think that's the real legacy of this farm. What it gave the Eisenhowers was a second chance on life and a life together.
Well, golly, Alyce, that made me have tears in my eyes.
Yeah.
What a beautiful denouement. So I would like to give anybody an opportunity to write some questions in the chat box, or perhaps think about some questions, and we can do Q&A. How beautiful. What a beautiful ending.
Yeah, I love that. I can just envision them together, you know, in that moment, and how important that home was to them. It's the only home they ever owned.
So are you ready to do Q&A?
Yeah, let's go.
All right. Who's ready to send in a question? Anybody want to unmute themselves?
This is Larry Boning in Denver.
Hi, Larry. Welcome.
I have two questions. So when Ike had the heart attack in 1955, he had started a painting. He was at a ranch up in the mountains outside of Fraser, Colorado. And he didn't finish the painting. He came back down to Denver, had a heart attack, and spent time in the hospital. But then a friend of his that owned Hallmark cards came out and said, if you finish that painting, we'll turn it into a Christmas card for you. And so I finished that painting, and it was made into a Christmas card for the Eisenhowers there that year. And does that painting hang in the Eisenhower Farm someplace?
It does indeed, Larry. I think you must have been reading my mind. I encourage you to follow us on our Facebook page. In about 2 weeks, I'm doing an art tour of the Eisenhower home, and I will be talking about Winter St. Louis Creek, which is the name of that painting you are referring to. Today, it is in the sitting room of the Eisenhower home. It's up on the second floor. It's a really beautiful painting, and most of the time, the general just gave away his paintings. You know, he gave them to friends and family. He didn't really hold on to them. Once he was done with it. But that was one of Mamie's favorites, so it remained in the Eisenhower home. So yes, you can see it today on the second floor of the Eisenhower home. But yeah, I just filmed a video about that.
And when do you go on Facebook with your tour?
I think we're going to be putting it up the week of July 12th. So I'll be doing a tour talking about the art in the Eisenhower's home, art that General Eisenhower did himself, as well as some of the pieces of art that the Eisenhowers owned. Should be fun.
Who owns the painting now? Is it owned by the Department of Interior? I understand John Eisenhower owned it at one point in time.
Yes. The vast majority of the pieces in the Eisenhower National Historic Site today are owned by the National Park Service, by the Department of the Interior. It's interesting that you bring that up. There was a gradual progression of how we received the objects in the home. John Eisenhower actually inherited almost everything in the house. So there were stages of donations to the farm. Many pieces the Eisenhower family very generously just outright donated to the farm when we opened in the summer of 1980. Some pieces were purchased from the Eisenhowers. There were some negotiations that way. And then some pieces were left on long-term loan, that they were still owned by John Eisenhower or other family members, mostly John, but we were allowed to have them on display. As years passed, those pieces, most of them, John ended up deciding just to donate to the Park Service, as he decided, you know, in various moves or for whatever reason, that he would not want to own those pieces any longer.
And where could I get a good reproduction picture of that, the St. Louis Creek?
Oh my gosh, that's a very good question. I know we used to have, Eastern National used to sell reproductions of that, but I'm not certain right now where you could get a real good reproduction.
They are not in print right now, Alyce.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
So I want to
Very cool.
I'd like to add something from the Eisenhower Presidential Library side of this, and I think this is really interesting. The Eisenhower Foundation, which is the support partner to the Eisenhower Presidential Library, still uses those Hallmark Christmas cards for their own Christmas cards. They reprint them and send them out every year, which I think is adorable. But the other thing they do for the education, for their K through 12 education program, they have an unfinished Eisenhower painting that they reproduce and let children paint it themselves and talk about Eisenhower and how he painted in his retirement years. And it's a lovely program.
Oh, and that's done by the Eisenhower Foundation?
Yes, the Eisenhower Foundation runs the K through 12 educational programming in Abilene.
Oh, great. So I could get that and get information through about the cards through the Eisenhower Foundation then.
Perhaps they can help you with that. So
And
do we
then
have
what
any
was
other
the
questions? I'm sorry, go ahead, I'm sorry.
One last question, then I'll be quiet. Well, who was the architect from Denver that Mamie called to work on the farm?
Oh, that's a very good question. Because the main architect for the house was not from Denver. I don't have that name, because when they first did the house, because when Mamie's referring to the porch, that was added only after the heart attack. I should have mentioned that, because the majority of the house was finished in April of 1955, and that work was done by Milton S. Osborne. He was affiliated with Penn State. Like I said, Milton Eisenhower is president of Penn State at this point. So President Eisenhower had a lot of connections with Penn State. So Milton S. Osborne was the main house designer who did all the work. So I assume when she's mentioning it, she called the designer from Denver, it was probably Milton S. Osborne, since he had done the main
Probably
work.
who?
Milton S. Osborne. So.
Oh, and she asked Osborne for it.
She was in Denver and she calls him, not that he was from Denver.
Oh, he just happened to be in Denver at the time?
I think, no, she was in Denver because she called, the porch is added on while the president is in the hospital. Because Mamie was worried when they got back to Gettysburg that he wouldn't have a good space to recover, that she didn't feel that they had kind of neglected like a family room, so she decides they had an open porch and they decide to enclose it. And that becomes the Eisenhower's favorite room in the home. The president always said if they ever built another house, they'd have to build the porch first because it was so.
Oh, funny. Oh, but so Milton Eisenhower also put on enclosed the porch then?
Now that was, I know, too many Miltons. Milton Osborne.
Or Milton Osborne, and he did the work to enclose the porch.
I'm pretty certain. Yep, he was their house designer. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
How could I get a hold of you if I had any follow-up questions here?
So we'll take, Alice, we'll take care of that at the end, okay?
Okay. Yeah.
We'll take care of that at the end.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I love questions. Don't be shy.
So do we have any others that have a question? I can't see everyone, so you might need to unmute yourself and talk. No more questions? Well, so Alice, I have a question for you then. The Eisenhower Presidential Library is not open to the public right now. And we have switched to an online programming platform, which is where we are right now today. We've added some things to our website for guests. So I wanted to see, are you guys open to the public yet? What have you done in this time?
Yeah, unfortunately, as of right now, we are not open to the public. We are hoping in the next couple of weeks to allow folks to tour the grounds. Everything's still a little up in the air. We do not have a reopening date for the buildings on site. So I encourage everyone, I see up on the screen, we have our National Park website that will have all updates about reopening, about what's going on with us in the current climate. We also had that up on the screen earlier, our Facebook page, which we're being very active with right now. We have lots of videos, and again, we will have constant updates that will let you know when you can get back on site and what we'll be offering over the course of the summer. I know everything's a little bit up in the air, but I do highly encourage you to follow us both through the website and through Facebook. The Rangers, all of us are working on some really exciting videos and digital content to share with you over the course of the summer. So if you liked this video, like I said, in about 2 weeks, I'll be doing an art tour of the Eisenhower home. I know all the staff are working on some really great projects, even expanding into World War II and the Gettysburg experience. And one of my co-workers and a good friend, Dan Vermilia, is doing some work on World War II burials in the National Cemetery. So there's a lot of great content that's coming out your way via the web. So all of you very loyal Kansans who are watching today, I got a lot of people coming from Abilene, you can enjoy the Gettysburg Farm digitally this summer.
Can you tell us the URL address of your website, please?
It's www.nps.gov/EISE, first 4 letters of Eisenhower.
Thank you. Nicole, if you are asking a question, you're on mute, or I can't hear you. You're not on mute, but I can't hear you. You want to type it in the chat box? All right, looks like Nicole's trying to puzzle it out.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see it there. So,
There we go.
yes, we do have 2 greenhouses on the farm that were gifts to the Eisenhowers while they were president and first lady. The Eisenhowers always had a little vegetable garden here on the farm. So normally what they did was they would start their vegetables in the greenhouse and then move it into the vegetable gardens directly beside the greenhouses. So they didn't really do like a lot of flowers or things. I mean, they had flower beds around the farm, but the greenhouses were mostly for the vegetables. They would get them started there before they got them in the soil. Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? All right, well, that looks like it. Well, before we actually end, I always like to thank the Eisenhower Foundation. The Eisenhower Foundation, as I mentioned a moment ago, is our support partner. And without the Eisenhower Foundation, we are not able to do these wonderful programs and connect with you, our community. The Eisenhower Foundation received sponsorship from the Union Pacific Foundation for our adult education programs for this year. So we'd like to thank both of those entities. I believe that is it. If there's nothing else from you, Alyce, I would like to say thank you and have our guests, our visitors say thank you as well.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I had a lot of fun today.
We'll come visit you one day, we promise.
Sounds good.